As someone said, today I want to talk about ethics as an enabler of policy. And it is, as he said, a sort of odd thought in a way. I mean, usually when making decisions, either publicly or privately, in formulating policies, we tend to think of ethics as a constraint. So I come up with a really gee-whiz idea for a research proposal, I get really excited about it, and then I think, ah, shit, there's no way I'm going to be able to get that past the ethics committee, and I just have to abandon it, right? Or, my aged aunt gives me some rings to hold on to her, until next time she needs them. I mean, she's in a nursing home, she's never going to need them again. It occurs to me, if I sold those rings, I could pay off my mortgage. Wouldn't that be a good idea? Ah, no, that's unethical, I can't do it. So you put it out of your mind. The president is dogged by pesky reporters and oversight committees and thinks, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if I could conduct this war in secret? But then he thinks, no, that'd be unethical, and so I ban covert operations, or at least I hope he would. In short, when we think about ethics, we think about constraints, and they sort of get in our way. Now, I don't deny for a moment that that's the way that ethics often works, indeed the paradigm way it works probably. We philosophers tend to talk about ethics as stopping modals. They're like traffic lights. They're things that tell us what we may and may not do and what we must and must not do. But much as traffic lights annoyingly constrain us as we move through the city, every time one of the damn things turns red, we have to stop, it actually does facilitate us getting through the city safely and efficiently and much more quickly than we would otherwise have been able to do. The claim of this lecture is going to be that the same is true of ethical constraints on public policy. They enable at the same time as constraining, and they enable because they constrain. The two central tricks that are going to make this analysis work if it does are these. First is the realization that enacting a policy, satisfying though that is for the guys who enacted against all the odds, is only the beginning, is not the defining moment that champions hope it is and that critics fear that it is. It's just the start of a protracted compliance game. That's the first thought. And the second is that we have to realize that the players in that compliance game have a dual preference function. They have in their preference function ethical preferences as well as egoistic or material preferences, and we can usefully play on each of those in order to secure compliance with our public policies. When I'm talking about policy implementation as a compliance game, I'm going to be talking about two distinct groups of people whose compliance is required. The first group is the public at large, whose behavior is supposed to be shaped by the policy. The second group is composed of powerful stakeholders whose compliance, collaboration, acquiescence is required if the policy is going to succeed. And I'm going to be claiming that as regards both of those compliance constituencies, grounding policy in ethics can help secure the requisite compliance. So that's going to be the claim. At the level of the public at large, I'm going to point to two ways in which that might work. The first way is essentially epistemic. There, the claim is that people will better be able to surmise what the policy actually requires of them if the policy tracks some ethical code, the content of which they already know. The second way is motivational. People will be more motivated to comply more readily with the policies that reflect their own sense of what is right and good. The more obvious of the two may be the second, or at least it may sound more obvious. It's going to turn out to be a little bit harder to pull that trick off than it sounds. I hope to be able to do it, but it's less obvious than it sounds. But let's work on the first claim first, the epistemic argument. The claim there, remember, is that public policy can elicit more compliance from the public at large if it hooks into their existing ethical understandings of what's right and wrong. So the thought's just this. In order to comply with the law, and public policies underlying the law, people have to know what the law requires of them. And how are they supposed to know that? That's the epistemic question to which ethics is the answer I'm going to be proposing. It's not enough just to say, well, of course, public policymakers should comply with the good rule of law standards and promulgate the law. They should print it in a big book and make that publicly available. Sure, yeah, fine, they should do that too. But that's not enough because there's just so very much law out there. Right? I went down to the law school and looked at the shelves. It's a shock. You go down to the area where the U.S. Code is stored. The U.S. Code is the official compilation of all the statutory law on the books. The U.S. Code runs to 364 big fat volumes, right? Okay, add to that, all the sort of state and local ordinances, all the administrative rules that apply to me. How on earth can you possibly know what's in all those books, right? I mean, how do you know the content of the law that actually applies to you, right? You can't just go memorize it. It's just too much of it. So saying promulgate, publish the law, well, fine so far as it goes, but we need something else to help us through that big pile of law books. So here's my proposal. If the law is written in such a way that it tracks morality and people in general know what is morally required of them, then people can make a pretty good guess as to what's going to be in those law books. So writing morality into the law increases the chances that people will be able to know, or at least reasonably guess, what they're required to do by the law, and that in turn increases the chances they'll actually comply with the law and the public policy underlying it. Now, it's not a strategy that's going to work entirely to tell us what the law is. We usually do as a matter of public policy, want to impose a whole lot of laws that don't connect up with anything morally or not in a one-on-one sort of way. Most of the rules of the regulatory state are like that. It's important that we have some sort of regulations, but the precise content is morally optional. It's just a matter of which one you pick out. Anyone wanting to know those sort of rules just has to go look them up. Right? Likewise, rules for how to evoke legal powers. So if you want to write a will, for example, that's going to stand up in courts around here, you better just go look up what the law here says you have to do in the form of words you have to employ to make a binding will. It's not something you can do from moral principles, from first principles of morality. But sort of bracket those, and there's still a lot of law and policy that is wide scope. It applies to everyone in general, not just specific people doing specific tasks, and is duty imposing rather than power conferring, rather than things like how to make a will. And on broad issues of those sorts, morality is typically far from silent. Most typically, there are some relatively determinate moral principles that law and policy can follow, and if it does, then people will have a better idea of what the law and underlying policy actually requires of them, and hence have a better chance of actually being able to comply with it. So in short, grounding policy on ethical precepts that are widely known gives people easy epistemic access to the law. It helps people know what the law requires without having to go look it up in the big book. To that epistemic argument, I want to add another. That's the motivational argument. That claims that people are not only more likely to know what the law requires, but also more likely to do what the law requires and the policy underlying it, if the law and policy conforms to people's own ethical views. Now, at first pass, that might look like a pretty empty tautology. It might look like I'm just saying, well, people will do what the law requires if people want to do what the law requires. There's more to it than that, though. Notice that the analysis is in terms of policy requiring what people think should be morally required of them, which is not the same as what they necessarily want to do, all things considered. The great challenge for the moralist and for any public policymaker trying to piggyback on morality is to get people to do what those people themselves think they morally should do in the face of the various other motives they have for doing something else. Right? Morality is not the only motive driving them. Right? It's one of them, but not the only one. Let me offer two stories to illustrate this motivational tug-of-war within people at large, on the premise that one telling anecdote is worth 1,000 controlled experiments. I'll start with an anecdote, and anybody who doesn't like anecdotes, hang on, there's some sort of proper experimental evidence coming. The anecdote is just this. 1996, state of North Carolina was hit by a big hurricane, not as big as Katrina, but a biggie. The city of Raleigh was seriously affected. You know, trees were down, lights were out, buildings were partially destroyed. You know, all the usual hurricane stuff. Hard on the heels of the hurricane came a heat wave. So first the storm knocks out all the power, then a heat wave above 30 degrees. With the power out, refrigerators not working, foods, medicines were at risk of being spoiled by the heat. People were anxious to find some way to keep these things cold in the absence of electricity, but of course with no electricity, all the ice in the city of Raleigh was melting as well. Problem. Solution at hand in the form of four yokels from a neighboring town that was less badly affected by the hurricane. They had the bright idea of hiring some freezer trucks, buying up lots of bags of ice, throwing them in the trucks, driving them across to Raleigh, and selling the bags of ice at 300% markup. Oh, okay, fair enough. People in Raleigh were really worried about their medicines, and, you know, people in America store a lot of frozen food, so, you know, a fortune invested in this freezer that's not working, right? So they were willing to pay anything for the ice, and they formed long queues to buy the ice, until the police finally arrived to arrest these four guys for violating the state statute against price gouging in a disaster. So what do you think the people queuing up for that ice did? Right? They applauded as the police marched off the four guys that were selling them ice that they so desperately wanted, were willing to queue for, willing to pay that high price for. Nonetheless, they applauded as they were marched off in handcuffs to jail. So the point of the story is just this, that the people queuing for ice clearly had a complicated preference function, right? I mean, part of them wanted the ice at whatever price, you know, and they were willing to queue for a long time in hot weather, you know, to get it. But part of them wanted those price gouging guys to be punished, and they were prepared to applaud the police as they dragged them off to jail, even though the goods that they wanted the ice to protect are now going to be spoiled. Well, so there's the anecdote to illustrate the dual preference function. Here's the more formal sort of evidence, and you may well have heard this one before. Just the experiments growing out of behavioral economics surrounding the Ultimatum Game. As the name implies, it's a take it or leave it game. Typically, fix sum of money, say $10 on the table. It's to be divided between two people playing the game. One of the players is assigned the role of the proposer, and he gets to make a proposal about how that $10 is going to be divided between himself and a respondent. The respondent just gets to say yes or no. No bargaining's allowed. If the respondent says yes, then the $10 is divided the way that the proposer proposed. If the respondent says no, nobody gets anything. Okay? And it's also, by the way, a one-shot game, so, you know, there's no, you know, doing a deal now with a view to, you know, some future playing of the game. It's just a one-shot game between these two individuals. Now, any economist is going to tell you that the obviously rational thing to do is for the proposer to propose a division that gives the respondent the smallest currency unit, you know, in the US 1 cent, right? That way, the proposer maximizes his take, gets $9.99. The respondent's not going to like it very much, but the proposer has all the power. The respondent might not like the idea that he's just getting 1 cent out of this deal, but 1 cent is better than no cents. And the economist says, hey, you know, one better than no, you know, can't you see, you know, the right answer here? And so for the standard economic prediction, it's just a blind obvious prediction. It's a sub-game perfect equilibrium for the proposer to get $9.99 and the respondent 1 cent. Just one problem. When you run this experiment in the labs, that virtually never happens. Right? What exactly does happen varies cross-culturally a little bit in societies, and this game has been run in Papua New Guinea, Highlands, and all over the place. In societies that haven't been deeply saturated by the market, what sometimes happens, surprisingly often happens, is that the proposer proposes 50-50 split, even though he had the power to bargain for something better. But even in societies like ours, market saturated, it is almost invariably the case that if the proposer offers less than 20% to the respondent just says no. Right? The respondent says no, even though the respondent is walking away from money. Right? He could have had 20% of the take, and he's not taking it. What's wrong with him, the economist asks. Right? He's crazy. He's walking away from that money. Well, people are just crazy in that way. Which is to say, they have internalized fairness motives, and they're prepared to pay real money in order to punish people who violate that norm too egregiously. And these results, as I say, are really enormously robust. We have all sorts of evidence like that of a motivational tug-of-war going on within citizens at large. They have internalized moral norms and principles, as well as being guided by considerations of a more self-serving sort. And that has real consequences for securing compliance with policies. If you believe people's self-reports in sample surveys, it seems that people are something like 50% more likely to obey a law if they think that it reflects the requirements of morality than if they think it doesn't. And they're 50% less likely to obey a law if they think that it is palpably immoral. Now, here my concern, remember, is with how policymakers can intervene in that motivational tug-of-war to make citizens more compliant with policies. Specifically, how does basing policy on generally accepted moral principles and defending it in those terms actually make those who are subject to that policy more inclined to comply with it, more inclined to act on their moral motives, more disposed to do what the policy requests of them? The mechanism to which I'd point is just framing or priming. If a policy is proudly proclaimed to be ethically grounded, then those people whose behavior it strives to shape are going to be prompted to think in ethical terms themselves and to let their behavior be guided by their own ethical principles and their own preferences to behave ethically rather than by some other motives that might otherwise have been in play. Okay? Now, survey researchers are familiar with this framing or priming phenomena. If you ask them, look, does it matter what order you ask the questions in? They say, you bet. If you ask that presidential approval question by asking, what do you think, how do you think Obama's doing? And then ask, what do you think the most important issue is? And then ask, how do you think Obama's doing on that? You get a very different answer than if you ask it the other way around. First, what's the most important question? Then, how's Obama doing on that one? And then overall, how's Obama doing in office? You get really quite different answers. The order of questions matters. The order matters because people are primed, framed, they're thinking in those terms, depending on which order you ask it in. Likewise, the psychologists have lots of evidence from their labs about this. You probably have heard the Kahneman Tversky story about, there's an epidemic and we can engage in this treatment regime. If we didn't do anything, 1,000 people would die. If we engage in this treatment regime, 600 people would be saved, but still 400 people would die. Well, it makes a really big difference to people, and it shouldn't, which you phrase it in terms of, whether you phrase it in terms of 600 people are going to be saved or 400 people are still going to die. The first they really like, the second they don't really like at all, although the same number of dead bodies is on the ground or in the morgue. It's just framing. There's nothing logical. It's just framing. It's telling people, look, think of it this way, and they, by and large, do. Practical politicians, or anyway, their speechwriters, of course, know all about this. It's no accident that George W. Bush, in the backwash of 9/11, very quickly stopped talking about it as a crime and quickly started talking about it as a war on terror. Framing it as a war rather than a crime evokes all those images about the powers that we should grant a president in times of emergency, in times of war, and therefore allows him to do all sorts of things that framing it just as crime would never have allowed him to do. All that's familiar. What I want to do by reminding you of that is simply point out that the same effects can be evoked by giving public policy an explicitly ethical framing. If people do indeed have ethical as well as other sorts of preferences, and that behavioral economics evidence suggests they do, then compliance with policy among the public at large will be higher if the policy is explicitly framed in ethical terms. Given that description of the policy, people will be primed to think of their own ethical reasons for complying with it, and in that way a lot of low-cost compliance can be secured. Well, so far I've been talking about how to secure policy compliance among the public at large, but as I said at the beginning, there are also typically all sorts of other powerful stakeholders who must cooperate or anyway not actively block implementation of a policy if it's going to succeed. So how does an ethical framing of policy help get them on board? Return to the traffic lights with which I started. No one wants to stop at lights themselves, but everyone benefits from everyone else stopping at the lights to let them through. It's the price that everyone pays to get others to stop, to allow them to pass in turn. The story is one of reciprocal self-binding to the benefit of all. Now, the same is going to be true among powerful actors in dealing with one another in implementing policy. Each benefits from the restraint of others, and each is prepared to show restraint himself on condition others show similar restraint. Of course, if they don't, then those who do not, or are not restrained, enjoy a strategic advantage over those who are restrained. So ideally, everyone would like to get a negotiation going so that everybody is subject to a binding agreement to reciprocate in advance. The trouble is often we can't pull that off. Someone has to make the first move without any guarantee that subsequent players are going to do the same. In such circumstances, again, the standard economist response is, look, don't do it. Remember Tom Hobbes. Don't lay down your sword in the face of your enemy. It's a dumb thing to do. But far from being a counsel of wisdom, that's often the counsel of counterproductive despair. Treating others as your enemy makes them your enemy, not because they're actually your enemy from the start, but because they see you preparing for war, and so they better prepare for war themselves, and so eventually you end up going to war, right? Now, all of this is wonderfully formalized in another staple of the behavioral economics lab, the trust game. The setup there is as follows. Two players come into the room, each is given $10. Player one first has to decide how much of his $10 he's going to entrust to player two. The experimenters, the guys running this experiment, will then match whatever player one gives to player two threefold. So for every dollar you give to player two, experimenters give him $3 more. So, it's fourfold. The player one gets, or player two gets four times whatever player one entrusts to him. Player two then has to decide how much of that profit to share with player one. Right? And again, it's a game that's played just one time between players, so there's no shadow of the future sort of thing going on. Now, economists tell us again that it would be stupid for player one ever to give anything to player two because there's no guarantee he's going to get anything out of it. And if it's a one-shot game, it's economically rational for him not to get anything out of it. Yet when the players are in the lab playing this game, player 1 typically gives something like half of his endowment to player 2. Now that little toy game actually pretty well represents what's going on among policymakers and co-implementers. To some extent, policymakers can negotiate in advance with powerful actors whose cooperation is going to be required, but they can rarely secure enforceable agreements to that effect. To a large extent, they simply have to go first and trust the others are going to play along later. In that setting, playing the ethics card, showing themselves willing to be bound in the policies that they enact by some external ethical constraints and not just railroading through any policy that they have the votes to get through, amounts to going belly up. Exercising restraint in that way amounts to the first movers in policymaking making themselves strategically vulnerable in the face of downstream co-implementers whose own contributions to the process come only later. Strategically, laying down your sword in the face of your enemies is dangerous, as Hobbes said, but it would only look that way if laying down your own sword isn't, as it turns out to be, a way of encouraging others to lay theirs down as well. My favorite example of how this going belly up strategy works well in actual policymaking is a 1970s example of whaling negotiations. In ordinary bargaining games, the last thing you want to do is to tell the guy you're bargaining against that, look, I really need this, I'm really vulnerable here. But that's exactly what the Japanese negotiators did in these negotiations. They went in and said, well, look, we actually depend for protein in our diet very much more heavily on whale meat than any of you guys. And so it's actually, pretty important to us to get a larger quota than you guys are going to take for yourself. Many of you take none. Well, that's fine. But we need it. Now, saying we need it is a very bad move in a bargaining game ordinarily, but it worked out really well for the Japanese because, the guys they were bargaining with turned out to be responsive to ethical appeals and said, well, okay, if you need it, fair enough. We'll give you a larger share. They had a fairness motive that they acted upon to their cost, or anyway, the cost of saving the whales, which is what they were there actually to do. And the Japanese got a larger quota in consequence. If you're in an assurance game, going belly up like that will pay off. Right? All that the other parties in those games are looking for is assurance that you will actually not take advantage of them if they play the cooperative strategy themselves. First movers playing the ethical card right up front provides that sort of assurance. Right? But suppose not all the other powerful actors involved here are playing the assurance game. Suppose some of them instead have prisoner's dilemma style preferences. So there are some assurance preferences here, some prisoner's dilemma preferences. The guys with prisoner's dilemma preferences, well, if you play cooperatively against them, they're going to say thank you and pocket the profit and leave you as the sucker, right? They're going to take advantage of your going belly up to make a great profit out of you instead of sympathetically responding to your gesture. So here's a second way in which playing the ethics card might actually assist policymakers. Imagine you're in this sort of mixed environment. Going belly up sends a signal that, look, I'm a nice guy. Well, prisoner's dilemma guys are going to take advantage of that in one round, maybe 2 rounds. But what it does is sends a signal to other guys who are actually assurance game players who would like to cooperate with somebody who wants to cooperate. They just don't want to be taken advantage of by those prisoner's dilemma guys, right? And so in the second, third, fourth rounds, what happens is that the guys who are prepared to cooperate if others cooperate get together. They club together and play just against each other, play just with each other, rather. And they leave the prisoner's dilemma players out in the cold. Now, it's more profitable for all concerned, in most cases anyway, to play with cooperative players who are prepared to cooperate if you cooperate. And so these little clubs are actually mutually advantageous. And the guys who are frozen out, who are not included in these cooperation circles, are actually worse off in consequence, and the mutual cooperators play nicely together. So insofar as the cooperation of some but not all is required in order to implement the policy, and some people get to choose with whom they play, then people would naturally prefer to play with people who could be trusted to cooperate if they cooperate. Insofar as people's propensity to cooperate if others cooperate can be reasonably inferred either from the reputations or from past experiences of dealing with those guys, then those circles of trust will develop, and trustworthy players will play with one another, and untrustworthy players will just be left out in the cold. Policy advocates and co-implementers get organized over time and repeated plays into communities of people who know that they can trust one another within limits to do the right thing in just that way. There are fancy computer simulations showing that that's what should logically happen. Even economists will have to concede that, I think. It fits with all of their models. Maybe one of the best descriptions of the process in practice comes from an account of the inner workings of an intergovernmental organization, the UN Economic Commission for Europe, back in the 1950s. This was a loose intergovernmental organization headed up, as it happens, by the subsequent Nobel Prize-winning economist and sociologist Gunnar Myrdal. Here's how he describes the functioning of this organization. He says, look, once the organization settles down to a tradition of work, the same officials come together at regular intervals. Certain substitutes for real political sanctions can then gradually be built up. They're all informal and frail. They assume a commonly shared appreciation of the general usefulness of the earlier results reached, and similarly shared pride of and solidarity toward the club of participants in a meeting. Not upholding an agreement is something like a breach of etiquette in the club, right? Sounds pretty flimsy, but it's actually pretty powerful. You get expelled from this club, it's going to cost you a lot, right? So the general picture seems to be this. You start with some widely recognized ethical principles. Those who show themselves willing to abide by them, at least in their dealings with one another, are admitted to the club of others who are likewise. Then some further more elaborate, more detailed norms begin to emerge within that club of cooperators. Adherence to all of those norms is the price of continuing membership in the club, and membership in the club being advantageous to all concerned, those ethical norms then become entrenched and relied upon all around, within the club anyway. So, just like those traffic lights with which I began, ethics constrain, they boss us around. People purport not to like that sometimes, but being subject to constraints, such as traffic lights, is what enables us, people with mixed motives, like us, with those dual preference functions, to live and work productively together. Business life would be impossible without the constraints contained in laws surrounding enforceable contracts. Policymaking of a more public sort would be difficult, if not impossible, if both the policymakers and those subject to their edicts didn't have and largely abide by constraints of a more purely ethical sort. In short, ethics are good for you, if only in a purely practical way. Thank you.